The chandeliers glowed like captive constellations above the Harcourt ballroom, their soft gold light sweeping across silk gowns, polished boots, and the faint shimmer of powdered faces. It was a night constructed for elegance, yet poised on the edge of catastrophe, for amid the murmurs of polite conversation and the flutter of fans lay the precarious fate of Lavinia Harcourt. At 22, she moved with a poise learned rather than inherited, her mind sharper than the delicate diamond pins threaded through her dark hair. She had promised her father she would endure this evening without incident, yet the weight of expectation only sharpened her restless resolve. Every greeting felt rehearsed, every compliment hollow, and every glance from the matrons lounging near the columns reminded her that one misstep could redraw the boundaries of her entire life. Her moment of downfall began not with a shout, but with a question, quiet, earnest, and intended only to clarify. Edmund Fairfax, newly ascended Duke of Ashcombe, stood near the center of the room, delivering a composed summary of the charitable projects he intended to oversee. His presence commanded attention effortlessly. At 24, he bore the dual burden of youth and power, and the aristocracy watched him with the wary fascination reserved for a rising political figure. His words were steady, refined, measured to avoid giving offense. Yet when he referenced the misallocation of estate funds affecting the widows and tenant children in Surrey, something in Lavinia's chest tightened. She had seen those ledgers. She knew the issue ran deeper than an unfortunate clerical error. She stepped forward before she had weighed the consequences. Her voice carried farther than she intended. Your Grace, if the matter were merely clerical, the widows would not have waited 6 months for relief. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Several fans stilled in mid-flutter. The shift in the room's air was immediate. A faint tightening, a communal bracing. Edmund turned toward her with a carefully neutral expression, but a flicker of surprise betrayed him. Perhaps no one had ever contradicted him so bluntly in public. Perhaps no woman of her rank had dared. I assure you, Miss Harcourt, he replied, his tone impeccably calm, the situation is being addressed with all appropriate diligence. Diligence delayed, she countered, unable to restrain the words now that they had begun. And while the matter is delayed, families suffer. The silence became a living thing. Edmund's jaw tightened a fraction. The surrounding guests dissolved into a hum of whispers, like a court of unseen judges conferring behind raised gloves. Lavinia felt heat rising within her, part indignation, part dawning fear. She had not intended to wound him. She had intended to defend those unseen voices who could not stand before a duke and speak for themselves. But courage and defiance were not virtues celebrated in a young lady of society, especially when directed at a man upon whose favor many influential families depended. Edmund inclined his head, but the gesture was cool, dismissive. Your concern is noted. He turned away, effectively closing the discussion and leaving her standing alone amid a swirl of widening scandal. The whispers sharpened as the evening wore on. Lavinia moved through the ballroom like a figure half present, every step measured to conceal the tremor in her chest. Her father's tightened mouth confirmed what she already feared. By the time she slipped into the carriage that would take her home through the midnight fog, the night's brilliance had collapsed into a suffocating gloom. She heard again the cutting hiss of voices, improper, impulsive, unbecoming of her station. Even those who privately admired her intelligence now stepped carefully away from association with her. The morning brought no reprieve. Her father summoned her to his study, his expression bearing more exhaustion than anger. He explained how the Fairfax name held immense political sway, how Lavinia's impetuous challenge might jeopardize alliances delicately maintained across years. She stood in the doorway, hands clasped at her waist, trying to absorb each word as though it were being spoken about someone else. You must remove yourself from London, he concluded, unable to meet her eyes. Pack your things. Go to Briarfield until we decide your next move. You need distance from this situation. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Shame pressed down upon her, heavy and suffocating, yet beneath it flickered a stubborn ember of conviction. She had spoken the truth. She had defended the defenseless. And for that, she was being sent away. The journey to Briarfield unfolded beneath a sky thick with low, colorless clouds. The countryside, usually a balm, felt strangely foreign, as though she were trespassing in a life she had never intended to live. Each turning wheel of the carriage carried her farther from the city she knew, farther from the expectations she had failed to fulfill, and farther from a man whose cool dismissal had wounded her pride more deeply than gossip ever could. When the carriage finally slowed near the estate's entrance, Lavinia pushed aside the curtain to study her temporary exile. The stone manor stood quiet and solemn, its gardens winter bare, its windows glinting with pale afternoon light. It was not the house that seized her attention. Parked along the gravel path was another carriage, dark and imposing, bearing a crest she recognized instantly, the Fairfax insignia. Her breath caught. Coincidence felt impossible. Fate felt intrusive. Whatever she had hoped to escape in London had arrived ahead of her in the countryside. And so, before she had stepped on a Briarfield soil, she sensed that her exile would not be one of solitude. Edmund Fairfax, her adversary, her unintended downfall, was here. And whether by circumstance or something more enigmatic, their paths were not yet finished intersecting. Lavinia stepped from the carriage at Briarfield with the composed bearing of someone determined not to betray her uncertainty. Yet the presence of the Fairfax insignia weighed upon her with greater force than any trunk she carried. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and fading autumn leaves, a solemn fragrance that marked the boundary between her old life and this imposed retreat. As she crossed the gravel path, she saw a groom leading Edmund Fairfax's team toward the stables, their polished harnesses catching the weak afternoon light. If she hoped the Duke's presence was merely passing, that hope unraveled the moment she entered the manor and learned from the housekeeper that he had taken residence at the neighboring estate, scarcely a mile away. Fate, it seemed, had little regard for her wish for distance. 2 mornings later, she encountered Edmund unexpectedly on the narrow lane leading toward the village. The mist clung to the fields, softening the world to shades of silver and gray. She had ventured out to clear her thoughts, but his sudden approach startled her from her solitude. He reined in his horse with practiced grace, though his expression revealed mild surprise at finding her alone. For a heartbeat, they regarded one another, the silence shaped by the memory of their confrontation in London and the consequences that had followed. "Miss Harcourt," he said, inclining his head with impeccable politeness. "Your Grace," she answered, matching his decorum though her voice held an undertone of frost. "I trust the countryside offers you respite from the city." "More respite than expected," he replied, as if choosing each word cautiously. "I did not anticipate such close company." "Nor did I," she said. "Yet here we are." The tension between them felt taut, like the string of a bow drawn back, but not released. They exchanged a few more formalities before Edmund guided his horse onward, leaving Lavinia with a curious ache, irritation, perhaps, or the faint sting of unresolved matters she had hoped to outrun. Their next meeting was far less avoidable. A week after her arrival, the local magistrate organized a village assembly to address concerns from tenant farmers whose winter stores had been damaged by an early frost. Lavinia attended out of habit. She had always taken interest in the welfare of those dependent on the land. She entered the assembly hall with the intention of remaining unobtrusive, only to find herself standing beside Edmund when a magistrate paired them to review reports of crop shortages. His quiet inhale signaled his displeasure at the arrangement, but she met his gaze steadily and nodded, determined not to retreat. The room hummed with worry as farmers voiced their fears. Lavinia listened intently, offering practical suggestions when appropriate. Edmund, to her surprise, did not dismiss her insights. Instead, he studied her with a quiet attentiveness she had not witnessed during their dispute in London. When she pointed out that surplus grain from the Fairfax estate could support Briarfield's most vulnerable families until spring, he did not challenge her. He simply asked the steward how quickly such provisions could be arranged. That simple act unsettled her more than their earlier animosity had. She did not expect cooperation from a man who had every reason to resent her. Later, as they prepared to leave, Edmund gestured toward the waiting carriages. "If it pleases you, Miss Harcourt, I will escort you back. The road is uneven after last night's rain." His tone was courteous, not presumptuous. She hesitated, but practicality outweighed pride. Once seated inside the carriage, the close space magnified every subtle shift in posture, every breath between them. The rhythmic clatter of wheels provided a fragile shield against the silence stretching out like an unspoken question. "You spoke well today," Edmund said at last, his gaze fixed on the window, as if confessing to the passing hedgerows. "I was unaware you possessed such familiarity with agricultural matters." "My father ensured I learned more than embroidery and social etiquette," she replied, unable to resist a faint edge in her tone. "Though knowledge is rarely appreciated when it comes from a young woman." He turned toward her then, his expression shadowed with something that resembled regret. "London's reaction to our dispute was unfortunate. I had no wish to see you harmed by it. Yet harmed I was," she said quietly, "not by truth, but by perception." His jaw tightened at that, but he offered no rebuttal. When the carriage halted at Briarfield's gates, he stepped out first and extended his hand. She accepted it with measured reluctance. Their gloved fingers met, and though the touch lasted only a moment, something cautious and unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that hostility no longer fit their circumstances as neatly as it once had. Over the following days, their paths crossed with increasing frequency, each encounter chipping away at the rigid boundary their earlier conflict had erected. She discovered that beneath Edmund's composed exterior lay a temperament capable of sincerity, even humility. He, in turn, seemed increasingly aware that Lavinia's intelligence was not rebellion but integrity. Yet the village was quick to notice their proximity. Whispers fluttered through shops and taverns, speculation feeding on glimpses of the Duke and the Baron's daughter riding together, speaking in lowered tones, or lingering too long after meetings about tenant affairs. Lavinia felt the weight of those whispers pressing upon her like an unwelcome shadow. She had been exiled once by rumor. She feared a second downfall might be beyond repair. One evening, as dusk settled over Briarfield, a letter arrived for her. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message brief. "Be cautious. The Duke's attention is not without consequence." No signature, no explanation, only a warning cloaked in anonymity. She read the words twice, her pulse quickening with unease. Whether the letter sprang from envy, malice, or misguided concern, she could not say. But the implication pierced her with the unsettling sense that her association with Edmund, however reluctant or innocent, was becoming a matter of scrutiny once more. She folded the letter slowly, pressing it between trembling fingers. Whatever fragile understanding had begun to form between them now stood vulnerable to forces she could neither identify nor control. And as the last light of evening faded beyond the windows, Lavinia sensed that the days ahead would demand a clarity of heart she had not yet dared to seek. The warning letter lingered in Lavinia's thoughts long after she set it aside, casting a lingering shadow over every moment that followed. She found herself studying Edmund from a cautious distance, uncertain whether the message had been intended as a threat, a kindness, or manipulation. Yet the more she attempted to maintain space between them, the more circumstance conspired to draw them together. 2 days later, the opportunity for clarity emerged in the most unexpected of settings: the walled rose garden behind Briarfield, where the late autumn blooms clung to life in soft shades of pink and fading crimson. Lavinia had retreated there in hopes of quiet, her mind burdened by conflicting impulses, fear of renewed scandal, irritation at her own vulnerability, and a stubborn curiosity about the man she had once publicly challenged. She walked along the narrow gravel path, her fingertips brushing lightly against the cool stone wall. The garden's stillness wrapped around her like a fragile sanctuary. Yet when she rounded a bend, she halted abruptly. Edmund stood on the opposite end of the path, arms folded behind his back, gazing toward the dying roses as if searching them for answers he had not yet admitted needing. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither willing to speak first. Then Edmund inclined his head with a restrained earnestness that unsettled her more than arrogance ever had. "Miss Harcourt," he said quietly, "I did not intend to intrude. I will leave you to your solitude." "You need not," she replied before she fully decided to. "Though I confess I am surprised to find you here." "As am I," he said, allowing a wry note to soften his voice. "I had hoped for a moment's reflection." "On the tenant matters?" she asked. "On many matters." His gaze lifted to meet hers, steady yet vulnerable. The faint breeze stirred a strand of her hair, and in that simple motion the distance between them seemed to narrow without either of them taking a step. She hesitated, then said, "There is something I must ask you." "The village has begun to talk." Whispered remarks, insinuations, and I received a letter. One that suggested your presence in my life is cause for caution. His brows tightened, but not with confusion, with concern, perhaps even irritation. "Someone warned you against me? Against the complications you may bring." He released a slow breath, as though weighing every possible response before settling on the truth. "I had hoped my presence here would offer relief from scrutiny, not invite more of it. If my actions have placed you in discomfort, I owe you an apology." "I do not seek an apology," she said softly. "I seek understanding." "What do you want from me, Your Grace?" For the first time, he seemed genuinely at a loss for words. He moved closer, stopping at a respectful distance, though the nearness of him set her pulse unsteadily aflutter. "I want—" He paused, adjusting his gloves as though the simple motion could steady his thoughts. "I want honesty between us, if nothing else. The truth is, Miss Harcourt, I have been reluctant to admit how deeply our encounter in London unsettled me. Not because of the public embarrassment, but because your words revealed something I had long ignored." She studied him carefully. "And what is that?" "That the responsibilities I inherited have consumed my judgment," he said, voice quiet but firm. "I took the reports of misallocated funds at face value. I did not question them with the vigor they deserved. Your challenge forced me to recognize my own complacency." His admission struck her with unexpected force. She had anticipated defensiveness, perhaps frustration, anything but humility. "Then you do not resent me?" "Resent you?" He gave a brief, incredulous shake of his head. "I find myself admiring your courage more than I can express." A warmth bloomed in her chest, delicate yet disarming. She turned away briefly, gathering her composure, then faced him again with a steadier gaze. "I spoke impulsively that night. I fear I ruined more than I repaired." "You acted with conviction," he answered. "It is a rare quality, even among those given every liberty to exercise it." Their conversation might have ended there, suspended in an uneasy yet hopeful balance, had the clouds not shifted to cast the garden in dimmer, cooler light. Edmund took a hesitant step closer, an unspoken question lingering in the space between them. "Miss Harcourt," he continued, voice gentled by sincerity, "I do not presume to know your feelings, but I would ask one kindness. Do not allow the words of anonymous cowards to dictate your perception of me." She met his gaze steadily. "And what then should guide it?" "My actions," he said. "If you find them lacking, I will accept your judgment. But allow me the chance to prove myself worthy of your regard." A silence followed, rich with possibility. Lavinia felt a flicker of something dangerously close to hope, yet she held herself with measured caution. "Actions speak, Your Grace, sometimes louder than intentions." He nodded, accepting the challenge with a faint, resolute smile. "Then I shall let mine speak clearly." A faint patter of rain touched the roses, catching them with glistening droplets. Lavinia glanced upward, then back at him. He seemed prepared to linger, to say something more, perhaps something that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. But she stepped back first, her breath uneven. "I should return inside before the weather worsens." He bowed slightly, though his eyes held hers with unguarded longing. "I will not press you further today." She turned, aware of his gaze, following her until the garden's curve concealed her from view. Each step felt heavy with meaning, yet lightened by the unexpected clarity he had offered. Still, uncertainty accompanied her like a silent chaperone. She had gained a glimpse of the man behind the title, but understanding him fully would demand far more than a single conversation. By the time she reached the manor's threshold, rain beginning to whisper against the stone, she sensed that the fragile equilibrium they had forged was only the beginning of something far more intricate and far more perilous to her heart. London greeted Lavinia with a familiar chill, its grandeur wrapped in the same polished indifference she had fled weeks before. Yet she stepped from the carriage with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The revelations in Briarfield, Edmund's humility, his respect, his willingness to confront his own failings, had softened the blade of her earlier resentment. Still, the city carried memories of humiliation, and as she crossed the marble threshold of her family's townhouse, she felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Her exile had ended, but judgment awaited, and she knew London society had an unyielding appetite for whispered stories. That evening her mother insisted she attend the Harrington soiree, declaring it a necessary reintroduction. As the lamps were lit and the final adjustments made to her pale lavender gown, Lavinia studied her reflection. Something indefinable had shifted in her, an inner composure forged not by obedience, but by the discovery of her own resilience. She pinned her hair with deliberate calm and descended the staircase, prepared to face her past rather than flee it. The Harrington ballroom overflowed with familiar faces, each bearing the practiced smile of those who feigned warmth while assessing every detail. Lavinia felt the gazes upon her, curiosity sharpened by earlier scandal, but she met them with quiet dignity. She moved through the crowd like a swimmer through cool water, steady and unhurried, responding to greetings with polite brevity. For a moment, she believed she might endure the evening with minimal incident. Then the atmosphere shifted. A subtle murmur passed through the room, a ripple of startled recognition. Heads turned toward the entrance as Edmund Fairfax stepped inside, tall and composed, his black coat impeccably tailored. His arrival commanded attention not through arrogance, but through a gravity that seemed woven into his very being. Lavinia's breath caught. She had not expected him to return to London so soon, nor to appear at the very event she attended. He scanned the room with measured intent, and when his gaze found hers, a subtle softening crossed his features, something warm, something resolute. Without hesitation, he began to cross the ballroom. Conversations faltered, fans stilled, and the orchestra's melody seemed to fade beneath the hush of anticipation. Lavinia felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with an awareness so intense it bordered on painful. When he reached her, he bowed. "Miss Harcourt." "Your Grace," she replied quietly, though her voice carried enough strength to match his presence. "I did not know you had returned." "I arrived this morning," he said. "There was a matter that could not wait." He offered his arm. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand lightly upon it. The simple contact felt like the turning of a key, unlocking something unspoken between them. Edmund led her toward a quieter corner, the crowd parting instinctively, curiosity sharpening like blades. "I will not prolong your discomfort," he said when they paused near a marble pillar. "But I cannot allow the falsehoods surrounding our disagreement to stand unchallenged." She inhaled slowly. "Edmund, you risk much by confronting this publicly. I risk more by remaining silent." His voice carried a certainty she had not heard from him before. "I made an error that night in London, not in disagreeing with you, but in failing to consider that you spoke from knowledge, not impulse." He stepped forward, not close enough to breach propriety, but near enough that his sincerity enveloped her like a quiet warmth. "Miss Harcourt, you defended those without voices, for that you deserved respect, not ridicule. If society demands a culprit for the discomfort of truth, let it be me." Before she could speak, he turned toward the nearest cluster of guests, individuals who had once delighted in discussing the scandal. His voice, clear and measured, carried easily across the polished floor. "I wish to correct an error," he announced. "During the charity assembly last month, Miss Harcourt was correct in her assessment. The funds had indeed been mismanaged, and it was my negligence, not hers, that allowed the issue to progress unchecked." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Edmund continued without wavering. "Her courage in speaking should be commended. I stand by her judgment and her integrity." He turned back to Lavinia then, the hush deepening. Every face watched them, breath held in collective anticipation. Edmund's expression softened, yet the resolve within it shone unmistakably. "I came here tonight for one purpose," he said quietly, "to ask if you might consider a future aligned with mine." Her heart stilled. "You would speak of such matters here?" "I speak here because I wish the world to hear it," he said, voice low but steady. "I do not seek to silence you, Lavinia. I seek to walk beside you, with your mind, your courage, and your unyielding sense of justice." Emotions swept through her: astonishment, gratitude, a fragile but undeniable joy. She glanced around the ballroom, seeing not the judges of her reputation, but witnesses to her restoration. Slowly, with a composure she had not possessed weeks ago, she met Edmund's gaze. "If I accept your grace, it must be a union of equals. A union of equals is the only kind I desire." Silence stretched between them, charged yet gentle. Then Lavinia spoke, her voice carrying the clarity of a long-awaited truth. "Then yes." A collective exhale drifted through the room, followed by murmurs of awe. The orchestra resumed its melody, softer now, as Edmund offered his hand. She placed hers in his, and the moment felt less like surrender and more like triumph. Their marriage took place weeks later in a ceremony illuminated not by spectacle, but by sincerity. Candles glowed warmly against white stone walls, roses adorned the pews, and Lavinia walked toward Edmund with unwavering steps. When their vows were spoken, it felt not like the culmination of circumstance, but the beginning of a partnership forged through truth, resilience, and the courage to defy expectation. As the newlyweds stepped into the pale winter sunlight, Edmund leaned close and whispered something only she could hear. Whatever he said drew a smile from Lavinia that held the full measure of her hard-won peace, a smile that promised their story had only just begun. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.